so that we can have a dialogue in this table. I'd like first to welcome our main speaker today. It's Magali Eben. Thank you so much for visiting us and for putting such an interesting paper for us to discuss here today. So it's great to have you at FGV. And I'd like to thank Juliana Domingues as well for promoting this joint event with USP Ribeirão Preto. It's a great pleasure for us to be participating in this intense week of events with Magali Eben from the University of Glasgow, and also leading the project Create at the University of Glasgow, and also one of the leaders of Ascola, which I should also mention, Magali. So thank you so much for being here. And I'd like also to welcome Rodrigo Fialho, our professor here at FGV, and Analígia. Rego, Analígia, thank you so much for being with us here today as well. I know that you're not able to be here in presence, but given that it's a hybrid event, it's perfect that you can also participate from a distance. So thank you so much. Before we move on, we have always a disclaimer that we need to read in events that we're broadcasting, like as this one. So the manifestations expressed by members of the staff of Getúlio Vargas Foundation, by guests who participate in the events online, represent exclusively the opinions of the authors and not necessarily the institutional position of FGV. We also reiterate that everyone present has agreed to participate in the event spontaneously, and with that authorize the use of their name, voice, and image, in addition to assigning the copyrights related to exposure of this transmission that later will remain in official channels of FGV and USP, so that anybody can access to that. To continue with this transmission, we ask you to express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement with this disclaimer. So thank you very much. Everybody agrees. We can move forward. So with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Magali Eben. It's a great pleasure to have you here so that you can make your presentation. And then we can move to comments from Professor Rodrigo Fialho, Analígia, myself, Juliana, and all the participants online and in presence here. Thank you so much for being here.
Does this work? I have to turn on.
Yes, that's better. I like that you've got such a long disclaimer. I thought only universities in the United Kingdom spent like 10 minutes on disclaimers, so I feel a bit better. We don't do the hands up, so I'll probably I'll have to tell them to introduce that. But thank you everyone for being here, even those who are supposed to be on vacation. I appreciate it. So as was said before, I lead the Create Research Center at the University of Glasgow. And when I first joined, I was a bit out of my depth because in this Create Research Center, which is the Center for the Regulation of the Creative Economy, which is funded by the UK government as the infrastructure for all research in the creative economy, I was kind of the outsider. I was the only one who brought competition law knowledge. And it was very clear that everybody looked at me and thought, what are you talking about? Okay. Which was in a way very nice. Over the last 2 years, I've brought in more competition people, so we're starting to be a bit more strong in the center. But really, it's been a humbling experience, because when people talk about creative industry, so we've got copyright lawyers, but also cultural economists, they talk about concepts like innovation in a way that makes no sense to a competition lawyer. So at some point, we started doing a project with the games industry of the United Kingdom. So I don't know if you know, but for those of you who like playing games, things like Grand Theft Auto and really Scottish products. And so we saw that the gaming industry was slightly in decline. So we started kind of talking about it. And what can lawyers do? Mostly we can't do much, but we thought here there was something we could do. So we started talking about what the problem was. And we realized that competition authorities in Europe are looking at the games industry, but they're looking at it really from a traditional perspective with product improvements and our traditional views of innovation. And the intellectual property lawyers in my team said, is this really what we should care about? This is where this comes from, this research. So should we care about innovation in a traditional sense, or is this some elusive thing, which I call creativity, which is more important? Now, what I'm going to talk about isn't only about the games industry. But the games industry, because I worked with it the most, is an illustration. All of these are ideas that I've never pitched to competition people before. So I am very open to being completely destroyed. Copyright lawyers love it. Don't know if competition lawyers will. So that's the pitch. Okay.
Shall we introduce the presentation? We've got it.
Oh, yes, that would be great if we have the slides.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I've got a clicker here, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the background. I have to say that a lot of the work I do in Create is very different from my normal work, because my normal work is the traditional, I sit behind a desk, I think, and I write it down on my own, very lonely. In Create, everything I do is collaborative. So it's not unusual to have projects with 4 or 5, 6 people. And this is also part of this. So there is a working paper that I have shared, which is about the gaming industry. So it's not specifically about the creativity point, but it's a broader paper. And I wrote it with a copyright lawyer, Amy Thomas, with a cultural economist, Kenneth Barr, and Aisha Gizam Yassar, who left us for London School of Economics, which hurt me so much, but is still a member of Create, and she's an innovation specialist. So we did this together, but there's other work with other colleagues like David Reeder and Stavros Makris, which is related to this. So, as I said, the pitch is, I think we need to talk about creativity more in competition law, not just innovation. I have tried to explain this by basically saying creativity in a way is a proxy for multiple things. In the cultural markets like games or books or films, creativity, I think, is far more explanatory. It's far clearer what I mean. But you could also think about it as market resilience in other economies, like energy, for example. So the idea being that if we look at a industry and we just focus on output measures, we might end up with a market structure which is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to external shocks, or it doesn't achieve the public interest of our society. So I'm focusing on creativity in the cultural markets, but I think the next step of this project would be to broaden this out and say, is there a way to ensure that energy markets are resilient if we focus more on the process of diversity within a market rather than on the outputs it generates? So I think traditionally, when we talk about innovation, we can talk about it in 3 kind of dimensions. So first, what are the infrastructures that allow us to innovate? So who has the assets, who owns them, the assets of production, the resources for research and development? The second dimension is who can be involved in the process of innovation and how do they generate product from the ideas they have? And then the last one is output. So innovation implies that there are new products. So what does that look like? I'm going to come back to these dimensions and talk about how I think creativity works for them. But that is kind of the general idea. Now, the difference between what we call creativity versus what is innovation is that creativity is the ability to generate original ideas, things that deviate from the norm. It only becomes innovation when it is produced and commercialized. So whenever we talk about innovation, we're really talking about that end goal, right? So an idea might be great, it might be novel, but it's not necessarily going to be successful and lead to innovation. So there's a difference between creativity and innovation. The key thing here is that creativity really is about originality, things that are different from what has gone before. And I think we're all familiar with the, I would say, never-ending debate about whether we should consider innovation in competition law. This debate has been going for decades, and I don't think we can kid ourselves and say that it will ever be solved. We're not quite sure how much competition you need for the right level of innovation. You know, every 10 years, an economist comes up with a new theory. We think sometimes, you know, more competition leads to more innovation. And then a few years later, we're told that's not true. Monopoly is better for innovation. I'm going to be very clear that I am not going to answer that question. In fact, I'm going to pretend that it doesn't exist. Okay. We have accepted in the EU particularly, which is where I focus on, but also in the UK, that innovation is a goal of competition law and should be considered. So I am not reopening that debate. The debate I am opening is whether we're doing it sufficiently, whether there is an aspect we are missing. And so I don't know how many of you have followed the innovation discussion or enforcement in Europe. But basically, there's been an evolution from just looking at innovation as kind of a justification for anti-competitive conduct. Then we said, okay, maybe we should promote competition and then hope that it will lead to innovation, just hope for the best. Then we had extra steps where we said, no, we need to protect innovation itself. And we came up with what I think is a very cool concept, which you have in the US, also in the EU, of innovation markets, right? So who competes on the resources, the assets for innovation? These are all very cool, but they're all really from the perspective of the big players. If you think about it, when you define a market for innovation resources, what you're doing is you have an investigation. You see that there are two companies merging, for example, and you say, well, are they innovating? Do they have resources? Do they invest in research and development? And you take that research and development project kind of as the product, right? You identify what kind of innovation a company that is under investigation is involved in, and that becomes your focal point. That becomes your standard for considering innovation in the industry, which makes total sense because that's how competition investigations work. But the result of that is that you're very likely to say that other innovation products that compete with that company's innovation are the ones that are similar, which leads you down a path of kind of forgetting about potential diversity of innovation. And in a way, this is a logical outcome of how we do competition cases. But I wanted to ask whether or not this might be reevaluated, whether we might say, well, should there be a consideration of protecting different ways of doing innovation, which we're not currently doing? And so this is where I want to really talk about creativity. So creativity, like I said, is a generation of original ideas, whereas innovation is when you commercialize those ideas. And my big question is, if you have an original idea that isn't the same as the main players in the market, can you ever get it to the market? Can you ever commercialize it? Can a really different idea end up being a new product? And so in those 3 dimensions of innovation that I mentioned before, I want to ask, well, if you have new products, is there a way where we can evaluate whether those new products are actually creative, are actually original? Another question I want to ask, and I think it's not as controversial, is who owns the assets that allow people to innovate? Is there a particular vertical problem where if a big company owns the assets for innovation, those that might be a bit more creative just can't innovate because they don't have the resources for it? And the last is, in the markets as they exist now, are we excluding those companies who could have brought something original to the table? And I think I'm not sure whether or not we should be doing this in competition law, but I want to pose the question. And the reason I want to pose the question is that in a lot of ways, copyright law, intellectual property law, they were meant to create this. They were meant to get us to a point where we had as much creativity and original ideas making it to market. And I'm sorry if any of my create colleagues ever hear this, but I think intellectual property failed on this. But I think they failed because competition makes, our competition law has not created the room to bring creative products to market. So let's talk about this for a second. So I want to start with, are new products creative? You could still see this there. Yeah.
It should be there as well, the presentation.
Perfect, yeah. Oh, that's great. So are new products creative? This is a particular problem in the games industry, where the question is, the products that end up coming to market, those innovative products, are they actually that original? But it's not just a games industry problem. How many of you are going to Deadpool versus Wolverine? I love Deadpool and Wolverine. I'm definitely going to watch the movie, but can we legitimately say that it is the most original idea on the planet? A lot of movies that make it to box office tend to be reboots of old movies or rip-offs of existing characters. The amount of live-action Disney movies I have seen is insane. I love them all, but are they most creative? They are really basing themselves on established intellectual property and making a lot of money off it. So for me, this is an important question. So we don't really look at this properly. There have been merger reviews in the games industry. One, I think the most famous one probably recently is Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard. Now, Activision Blizzard, I don't know how many people actually game, but Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, they are a behemoth of games production. And the UK and the EU actually had different opinions on how to deal with this merger and the remedies to establish, which was in itself very interesting. And the UK was a little bit criticized for coming up with a wild new theory of how this merger was going to stop innovation in cloud gaming. I don't know how many of you know what cloud gaming is, but it's supposed to be this breakthrough. It's currently not, but it's supposed to be this breakthrough where instead of downloading games and taking up lots of space on your machine, on your console, on your portable device, you can just stream games, basically. And then Microsoft gives you a subscription model, which is kind of like the Netflix of games, where you can just stream loads of games. The problem with cloud gaming is that the speed, the latency of playing cloud games isn't so great yet. However, the competition authority in the UK said, yes, but Microsoft has all the assets to become the key player here. And if they then also get all the big games like Call of Duty and World of Warcraft, they're going to be a powerhouse in cloud gaming. Great. This is really an innovation theory, right? They're saying if you want to innovate, you need these assets. Neither the EU nor the UK described any kind of diversity or creativity element to it. When you see the CMA, so the UK Competition Authority, and games market participants, they all talk about how innovative the games industry is, because look, we've got so many new games coming out all the time. And the quality of these games is amazing, which is true, like the speed, the visuals, all improved. But the question is whether this is the kind of innovation that is the most creative. Because a high number of games and a high quality of them in terms of specifications doesn't necessarily mean these are the most creative games. Most of these big games are triple shooter games. So basically, the amount of times that a game can come out where you just shoot people, it just apparently there is no limit to it. But it's just often a repeat on that. There are other games out there, but there is an increased risk that they might struggle to survive in the cloud gaming system. And so I thought there was a really interesting piece of work by Rietveld and Ishihara, who tried to assess the impact of increased consolidation, so more mergers and acquisitions in the games industry on innovation. And what they did is that they interpreted innovation, in my opinion, as creativity. Because instead of looking at the amount of intellectual property registrations or the number of games that were coming out, they went at the product level and they tried to figure out how many games were based on entirely new concepts, entirely new intellectual property. So new characters, new games lines, and so on. And their conclusion was concentration in the games industry leads to more revenue, higher quality visuals, but lower levels of creative innovation. The more concentration, the less diversity of games. And I thought that was an interesting first question. So my first question is, the output is not creative, but it is high quality. Is that an issue? If we're focusing on consumers, maybe what they want is a really pretty game that is the same as a previous game. But maybe we should ask whether that is what we want. Then this is related, I think, to another question, which is who gets to be involved in the process of creating products? And I've got a picture there, and I don't know if you can see what it says under that, but members of Create survey the current state of the games industry, and basically everybody's dying, right? And this is a true problem. So currently in the games industry, small game studios are struggling to survive. One of the reasons they're struggling to survive is because companies like Microsoft and Sony buy small game studios, realize that the games from those studios are not going to make as much revenue as the triple shooter Call of Duty games, and close the studios. And those games disappear. And so this means that it's quite difficult for a small game studio, which might have a more original idea, to survive. Very different from things like books and other creative products. The cost of making a game is extraordinarily high, and you don't see a payback until years after. So you need some kind of upfront investment. And so the idea that you might get picked up by a big company actually helps you, or you get investment from big companies. And so when you're a small game studio, so for example, one of the studios was closed, it was called Tango, and they created a really critically acclaimed game called Hi-Fi Rush. They get this really great game, everybody loves it, and they, I think, this is my opinion, I'm not speaking for them, but I think are quite happy to be bought up by a company like Microsoft because it gives them investment for the future. But then when companies like Microsoft and Sony realize they can make more money from Call of Duty and other games and close down the small studios, that was a gamble that didn't work out for the small games. So I think there is a question here about how you can ensure a diversity of creators. And we saw very much in discussions with the games industry, with some games companies who came to talk to us at Create, that they feel very much that they depend now on a handful of big companies. The intermediaries that used to exist that would invest capital in the hope of later a return on the games are reducing. And the reason for that is that the technological changes have led to bottlenecks, right? We all talk about ecosystems like the app stores, but there's also ecosystems in the game stores, in cloud gaming. All these new business models actually push you towards the ones that will have the most revenue quickest, and make it very difficult for a small games company to make it and to get access. And I think this one, the infrastructure question, is the least problematic for me in a way, because if there's anything that Europe is now definitely going after, it's this ecosystem power. So I have fairly high confidence that this is something that will be looked at. Although in the UK, we contributed to a study on music, and at the time, the UK's competition authority said, yes, there might be an issue for access, but consumers like what they're getting, so it doesn't matter. But I think there is a bit of an evolution in the last few years where we're talking a little bit more about this point of diversity. So really the things that I think are the most interesting as questions is whether the products we end up getting are actually the most original we could have. And then secondly, whether there is a problem in whether smaller creators can be involved. Now you might sit here and think, it doesn't really matter. Consumers like it, so fine. But actually, real gamers are unhappy. And the reason they are unhappy is because of this thing called modding. Does anybody know what modding is? Yeah, a few. Before cloud gaming, right? You could, and this is my very basic explanation, but you could download the code of a game, and there were exceptions in intellectual property, which allowed users to kind of modify the game. This could be because it allowed a company to bring out a game, and then the users would change things and improve the game from inside. So there was this community of kind of cooperation. But what also happened is some of the most impressive games that came out were actually modded versions of original games. With cloud gaming, this is impossible because you do not download the game code. So you're basically streaming and you become passive. Where you used to be interactive, you are now passive. And we did a roundtable at Create where we brought different people together. And some people said to me, yeah, but all I care about is playing Candy Crush on my phone. Like, fine, but there are some people who want to be able to download the game and create a follow-on a new game from it. That's impossible with the new technologies that are coming in. So there is a question about consumers here. They also are being excluded from what could have been a creative enterprise. Okay. Now, all of this is me telling you there is a problem. We're not looking at creativity, but should we? I have kind of in the last 2 years, because I've been so ingrained in talking about the games industry now, I've come up for air and I think, well, does competition law not have enough to deal with already? The problem, of course, is that if competition law doesn't do it, who does look at it? Is there a different way of looking at it? One of the questions I want to ask in coming research is, should we consider creativity in competition law enforcement? And if we did, what would that look like? I think it should be a dimension of how we look at innovation. But I'm very happy to have a debate about whether you think that's just going too far. But the next step after that is, I want to see how that translates to the economy as a whole. I think we are in a severe problem in Europe that I've talked to some people about. I mean, as Europeans, we like to think we're doing everything right, but our productivity is lagging. We are extremely vulnerable to external shocks. And, I don't know how much you followed this, but, when one company, CrowdStrike, made a mistake, all our planes were down. We are in a very vulnerable position. So I think this creativity question goes beyond just cultural products, but it's about, should we have a diversity of people involved in the process of innovation so that we are not dependent on one or two companies that can accidentally, let's not think, with bad intention, but accidentally bring down the system for a few days. It's insane. So I think we're vulnerable. I think we're not productive in Europe anymore. And we keep talking about our standard of living. And I love living in Europe. I think we have a very high quality of living, but it's not going to survive because we're so dependent on just companies. So you can hear me better. Anyway, but that's a very good sign for me to round this off. So I think the question I would like to pose is whether you think this is something we should consider, and maybe it's something that you have better insight here. But also, do you think there is a broader question about the resilience of our economy as a whole, which might be a next step on this? So, yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Eben. And now pass the floor to Professor Rodrigo Fialho for comments, questions, so that I can start the discussion. Thank you, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much, Caio and Juliana, for organizing this event and for the invitation as well. It was a pleasure to be here sharing this panel with you. And thank you very, very much, Professor Magali. I just learned a lot from you, but I would like to learn a little bit more. That's why I brought you some questions about your research. And I have two questions here. The first one is related to concentration of the creativity markets. You seem concerned in your papers with concentration and integration of those markets. Looking to other technology markets, we can find other groups also concerned with concentration. For example, the new Brandeisians. However, they are being criticized for not suggesting actual new tools, methods, or models for merger control, for example. Some people argue that even though they really recognize that they are dealing with technology markets that are different, that are new, that have new characteristics, they are just bringing back from the past merger control tools, merger control models, etc. So with that in mind, considering your contributions to the creative markets, are you already thinking about the possibility of suggesting actual new tools for the merger control in those markets? Or do you think that there is no need for new tools and we should just stick with the traditional ones? This is the first question. The second question is more related to Brazil and developing countries. When we are talking about creations, it seems that inequality plays an important role here. For example, you suggest that we should be more concerned with creativity process and diversity of creators. But in a country with high levels of inequalities, we may have a more profound problem here. And this problem may undermine the creativity process. For example, we have inequalities in the access to technology, to devices, to gadgets. And we have also problems with regards the access to education itself. Even though creativity may be a gift in some cases, I believe that it can also be developed by education and training. So that just a small part of the population in Brazil, for example, who has access to technology, gadgets, and education will be able to become creators. And because of that, we may start the creativity process already with a concentration of people who had access to proper education and to technology tools. So I would like to hear you about this, especially whether your research and you are considering these differences that we have in Brazil and other developing countries, and whether you think that antitrust and intellectual property should play a role here, especially with regards to inequalities. That's it. Thank you very much.
Those are some great questions. Not easy, but great. Okay, actually, the first is the easiest, but I think the second is most interesting. So I'll start with the first. Right. First of all, there is a really big difference between the US and the EU when it comes to this neo-Brandeisian movement. The EU doesn't need neo-Brandeisian because we've never gone completely to the, consumer welfare that isn't consumer welfare standard. We've never done that. What we did do is that we wanted to modernize our system because very, very rightly, in my opinion, there was a criticism that our competition authority in the European Commission was arbitrary in the cases it brought and how it did it. So what we did at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, was to try to bring in more rigor, more clarity, more structure. And economics was a way to do that. It doesn't have to be the only way, but it was the way to do that. And I think it's still one of the most obvious ways of doing that. I am a big fan of tools. I think later this week I will talk about market definition. I love structure. Maybe it's because I am a lawyer, right? We love structure. But I think there is something you need structure, you need clarity in order to abide by the principles of a legal system that abides by the rule of law. That's why I fundamentally agree with a lot of the problems that the neo-Brandeisians have highlighted. But I wonder how we get to a system that allows us to take in more objectives, more interests, whilst retaining a test, right? A way of checking that the decisions by the authority aren't arbitrary. But as I said at the start, I think this was always in Europe. We've always looked at more than one thing. We've always looked at multiple objectives. And in fact, before 2003, we looked at labor and inequality. In our cases, we started doing less of that because we wanted more rigor, but also because, this is being recorded, but anyway, I think the European level didn't necessarily trust that the national countries, which were also involved, could have a consistent approach if you had so many different objectives. Do I like more objectives? Yes. Do I think we need tools? Yes. I think what we're talking about isn't necessarily about proposing new tools, because I think they already fit within the innovation tools that we have. And I think looking at let's take an example. If a big games company buys up smaller games companies, it doesn't take so much extra thinking to say, what is the objective of the company in the end? It's to get a return on its investment. Does buying up these small companies eventually lead to that? Or is there a risk that they will not be killed off? I don't think these are killer acquisitions because I don't think there's the intention, but they will be sidelined because bigger games will bring more money. For me, this fits entirely in what we already do in merger control. It's just that I don't think there is a conscious decision to say, maybe there is a value in having more original things come to market, and maybe we should look at that. On other things, I in other areas of my research, yes, I when I bring something forward, I try to come up with a method of looking at it. That doesn't necessarily have to be a tool. I think we lie when we pretend we have such strong tools and methodologies. Things like hypothetical monopolist test or the SNP test in market definition, which is what I did my PhD on, are not real tools. There are ways of looking at something, but there's no real solid test. We only ever bring in real solid tests when we bring economists into cases and they give us 6 different answers. So I think we have to be a bit careful in saying we need a really strict tool for everything, because that's not how competition enforcement works. But I do think we need something that brings rigor. So that's a long answer to say, I like what the neo-Brandeisians are doing, but I think we do need more. We need a way to make this possible. Your second question was much harder. Inequality. Yes, I mean, the easy answer is I don't think this is a competitional problem, but I don't think that means we shouldn't be talking about it. And I am very well aware that the situation is different in Brazil from the United Kingdom. But in Create, we have this discussion a lot because we did a study on journalists and we realized that the only journalists and book writers, that the only ones who can actually make a living are rich people who came from rich families and men. White men and people from rich families are the only authors that can actually make a living from their work. So there is a problem, I think, globally, that things like art are only really accessible to a small select few that had a really high level of education, but more than that, come from really well-off backgrounds, or, this was another thing, are supported by a rich family member. So one of the things we saw is that, you know, if you're a woman and you want to publish, you better find a nice rich man who wants to take care of you so you can write your books. As my partner always says, you know, he sees a future in which all I do is write and he brings in the money, except he is not rich, so it's not going to work. But that is really how it works, even in places like the United Kingdom. So I think there is a fundamental problem that is not as bad, right, in Europe, but is already there. So if we already don't know how to fix it in Europe, we don't know how to tell you to fix it here. And to me, this is an education problem, but it is also about consciously investing in particular segments of the population, which is, you need the political will to do that. And I think competition authorities go too far sometimes, or we try to get them to go too far sometimes. We are not a tax body. We cannot subsidize. And really, ultimately, that's what it needs. You need to invest massively in education that is accessible to all and of high quality. It's not enough to give everybody the right to go to a school if the school isn't as good as a school that a rich child goes to, right? But that's not a competition problem we can fix. But I don't know if this makes you feel any better that in Europe, we still have this problem. So I don't know if we haven't fixed it. I don't know how to tell you to fix it here, but I do know that it's not a competition issue. Same thing for academia, by the way. Like even in the UK, there are more people now from what we call, you know, the working classes, but it's still a minority of people. A lot of them are from good families, well-resourced families, or they're people like me who came from another European country and didn't have to say which really good school they went to. So there is a problem in Europe. If we fix it there, I'll come back and tell you how you can fix it.
Fair enough. Thank you very much, Professor Eben. And now can hear from Annalisa. Professor Annalisa, welcome, and thank you for joining us even from a distance. It's great to hear you here. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So first of all, let me say hello to Professor Magali. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been interacting with you mentally over the last few days, reading your so I hope we can continue this interlocution. I would like also to say good morning to Professor Rodrigo, my colleague at FGV as well, and to thank immensely not only colleagues and also people I admire very much, and I can say friends, Caio and Professor Juliana. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this, first of all, Professor Magali, I wanted to congratulate you. No, first of all, the most important comment: Deadpool versus Wolverine. You must watch it. And I think it is surprisingly innovative. To tell you the truth, I think that smarter dialogues I've seen in a while, so I think it's super worthy. And we can talk about innovation if you find it innovation or not. But I think it really innovates the language. But so my area of research nowadays, I come from an antitrust background, but nowadays I navigate much more on the behavioral science space and a lot of on the compliance space as well. And I'm always looking at those problems because sometimes I feel a little bit of a nice kind of envy from the antitrust problems, because I think this would give good legal advice. This would give good work for a law firm, because there's a concrete industry case, right, for everything you are proposing on research. And I think from an industry perspective, it was about time that a serious center such as yours was looking at the game industry as a policy problem, right? I think you are building very elegantly the case that there is a strong competition, innovation, and intellectual property case for the industry, and you bring very interesting data about that as well. But I think to spice up the debate, I wonder. And we were talking about privilege, and Professor Fialho was talking about inequality and as well. And I was wondering to what extent the gaming sector is a public policy issue. And secondly, when we think about the competition space, we are concerned with much more limited variables, right? The price of the gaming, or the price of things, that the tokens that you buy within the gaming universe, and perhaps some niceness about the speed of innovation to increase players' welfare, right? And I was wondering whether this would be a little bit of a limiting perspective. I think antitrust has been challenged everywhere in the world, to asking, do you think you should, and that's also wanted to hear your views about that. Should we think that antitrust should insulate itself so much? I am very active on the sustainability debate, right? And there is a big question about how much antitrust should be used as a tool, a public policy tool, to foster sustainable competition among companies, because it's very easy for you to acquire markets in a competitive, if you're playing down other things, such as carbon emissions and labor rights, etc. And many times the response that you get from the antitrust community is to say, no, this is not an antitrust problem. There is a division, there is a governance. But is it so? Is it possible to talk about legitimate conquering new business if you were playing down those other legal values that we have around the society? And I will tell you about a little bit of what I know from the gaming universe and the discussions that we have in Brazil. I think gaming is not as on the entertainment, because music, I think, and I had that, I remember being part in some events, and Caio wrote about that as well in the past, that we have in the creation on the artistic area and the journalism area, we have some constitutional protections for regulation, right? Because it's a free market of ideas, there are constitutional freedom of speech protection, so nobody kind of could touch it. Maybe antitrust could touch it, but really not get into the merits. Art also has another connotation, but gaming is perhaps, and when you brought the Minecraft for kids, I think the main public policy in gaming, specifically in Brazil, is related to its behavior effects on people, right? A lot of the youth mentality nowadays is built around what happened in the video game space. And if you, some of us have children, and if we try to helicopter them just to monitor what happens in the game industry and the live gaming fields, there are all sorts of terrible things happening as well while people are getting entertained. For example, racism and a lot of extreme ideals being shared by game participants. Is this really the game? Or is this the nowhere land where nobody dare to enter? So I was wondering whether there would be any idea, because you were merging competition with innovation, but I was wondering if we could merge also regulation of behaviors. So should anybody establish the settings? There's another thing is games can be highly addictive as well. So is there anything that from a public policy perspective, we should be asking for those companies who are thriving in the market to present as a proof that they are also looking into this? And I think, thirdly, there is another financial regulation strong aspect to it, because a lot of the games, they also involve a second economy, a tokenized economy, where there is digital currency being negotiated. So a lot of savings from families and youth are being used or are being invested in purchasing power that's going to be executed within the gaming industry. So to try to summarize what I'm trying to raise here is that, do you see any other boundaries for the antitrust to interact with all other public policy problems other than innovation? Do you think there is a role for that in the antitrust rationale, or would authorities be accused of just passing the line? And there is another concept that you bring that I found interesting, that you speak about active customer. So I was wondering how would this be different? Because nowadays consumers are vocal in every industry, and there is a lot of feedback from consumers built into client service. We live in the era of client centricity. So is that really that different from the games? I know there is the coding part, the creation of content part, but I think consumers are very active everywhere. So I don't know how much that would differ from other industries. And I think there is another, and I will try to close my remarks with that. There is another impact that you kind of direct to it, but I think you could also expand, because there is a whole supply chain for the game industry as well. So from designing to furnitures related to gaming, to joysticks, to consoles and other things, that perhaps there is a spillover, a positive spillover. And if we think about the reasons this is my initial area of study, law and economics, we always have this question about whether we should regulate a market or not. And I mean, I know that nobody kind of feels so strongly about let's regulate games, but all the market failures are there. Concentration, externality, information asymmetry. We kind of just don't feel it should be regulated for some strange reason, but theoretically, there should be no justification for the state not to look at those things. So, and that was, I promise, was the last remark, but that was the compliance one I wanted to make also. There is also a strong room for unfair competition within the gaming industry because of compliance issues as well. So for financial crimes and non-compliance of all other regulators, that would be also a reason to regulate in order to prevent those things from happening. So should we regulate gaming?
Okay, I'm gonna do the thing where I answer your last question first. Absolutely, this is a sector that exhibits many market failures. And to my mind, there is an answer to your regulation question, which ties into your antitrust question. If we regulate a sector, we can have a holistic view of market failures without having to push antitrust beyond its boundaries. In fact, I think it's far more legitimate to have a sectoral regulator that deals with these problems that are market failures generally, rather than an antitrust authority who only ever comes in on a case-by-case basis and might be missing things. So when 2 years ago we started looking at the gaming industry and Create, after about a year of research, I was like, oh, we need to regulate the sector. This is insane. It's also one of the most lucrative, profitable sectors. We need to do something about this. And then we invited people from the games industry. And they said, talking about your supply chain issue, they said, there is a problem where we depend significantly on a handful of companies and we are subject to their whims. If they change their mind on how they run their business, we have to suddenly change our whole game, despite the fact that we have invested millions of pounds in it and worked on it for years. Suddenly, either this game goes in the bin or we have to change it. And so they were talking about how dependent they are and how upset they are. And then when I said regulation, they said, what are you talking about? Because they feel that it will be far more effective to have informal, like what they call gentlemen's agreements to fix this, than regulation. To the point where there is, at least in the UK, some laws that regulate behavior, they opt out via contract because of the power dynamics in the industry. So I was sitting there thinking, so what is the solution, right? I don't want the competition authority to transgress beyond. So I think creativity and innovation fits, at least in Europe, very much in what we do as a competition authority. I don't see a problem. But to go beyond that and solve behavioral issues, to me, is a regulator's issue or economic dependence. But the companies in the sector that are suffering don't want regulation and say they will opt out by contract if regulation comes in, which obviously leaves me as a legal academic in a really upsetting situation where I can go and say, as we did at some point, maybe we should have regulation, knowing full well that the games companies that were 6 months ago sitting at the table with me over coffee were saying, over our dead body. Right. And so that leaves you in a weird position if people in the market say they don't want to abide by it. So this is, to me, an unfortunate situation we are in. That doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't regulate. I think there is a signal out of regulation, but with the knowledge that it might not lead to the effects that we want. In Europe, we have adopted the Digital Markets Act. Is that gonna, I mean, my opinion, is that significantly gonna change the industry? I very much doubt it. But I think it's a signaling tool. So similarly, I would say we can regulate as a signaling tool. Is it gonna overnight make the industry better? I don't think so. So this is about regulation. About the behavioral issues. One of the things that I am a big proponent of is holistic regulation, where we have things like a competition authority or a financial authority or different authorities or consumer protection, and they do their job and they maintain their job within their specific, well-defined area. But there is a separate holistic regulator that looks at problems that combine them all, cooperates with them, but say, you know, there is a problem that goes beyond just competition. And I think the violence of games is one of them. The fact that you have homogeneity of games also means that there are far more shooter games, far more violent games. This isn't necessarily about the competition, innovation, creativity point I make, but it is related. Because if you have more diversity, you get little games where you have, you need to as a child, you need to make the little bird fly. That doesn't make Microsoft any money, right? It's not a big enough game, but it's also not a violent game. So there is a relationship there. Similarly with the in-game purchases. I mean, I know of people whose children have inputted their credit card and by the end of the month, they realize how much money has gone off. That is a problem, not just in games, it's a problem in apps generally, right? And we have a lot of discussion about Apple saying they vet all the particular apps for security and safety. Why don't they vet apps based on that? Now, a more holistic regulator could say, maybe this is an obligation you should have. I think this is what they're trying to do in the United Kingdom. They have a Digital Cooperation Regulation Forum, DCRF. They're very interesting, but they are a network of cooperation between regulators. They are not a separate holistic regulator, but I think there is a step there that we could take. And I think academia should do this more. We should have holistic research where we look at a problem from different angles, and then we can make a suggestion on holistic regulation. But yeah, I think you're asking, is the games industry a public policy issue that we should care about? Absolutely, because I think it impacts on so many objectives of a society. Games are a way that people educate themselves. How many of you have used a games app to learn a language? Duolingo, for example, is a game, right? There are now these, basically products are becoming gamified. I am very bad at watering my plants, so I downloaded an app that rewards me with tokens and little games if I water my plants. In a way, games are becoming ingrained in a lot of facets of our system, including education. And I think what is the most important in our society is to ensure that whatever goes to our children is highly, highly looked at. That doesn't mean you have to have a legislator come in everywhere, but if there is one place where we should intervene, I think it's anything that touches kids. But I will say this again, I don't think it's competition authority that should do it, because we are just not smart enough to do it, right? I love us all. I think we are amazing, brilliant people. But do we understand things that go beyond the law and economics of competition? Maybe you do, but I don't. So I don't have as much faith in putting all of this in the hands of a competition authority. I don't know if that answered all of your questions.
No, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Magali.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Professor Eben. And as Juliana, if she wanted to speak, she said I should speak first and Dario, and then okay. So I'll also take my role here as moderator and make a couple comments as well, as the paper and the presentation were really thought-provoking. So I think it's really interesting to keep going on this debate here, Professor Eben. And here, one thing that caught my attention is the way that you try to frame the different levels that creativity play in the gaming industry, right? So there's certainly a discussion of creativity on game production, so that different game studios will come up with different ideas and you can have diversity there. You also mentioned the presentation, the second level of that's users kind of tweaking the code, right? The moding example that you mentioned. And there might be even a third level that I think you mentioned also in the paper, that is users not really tweaking the code, but actually creating things within the game, right? So think of role-play games or things like that, where users not necessarily tweak the code, but they do create avatars and whole roles within the game. So you have all these different levels. And my point here, and what got me thinking, is that just as we have discussions about consumer welfare in multiple site platforms and affecting multiple sites in different ways, you may have different effects on creativity in these different levels, right? Sometimes you may have concentration reducing creativity in the production level, but to the extent that you have more users connected in a single role-play game, for instance, you may actually increase creativity within the game in creating bigger roles with different alternatives inside the game. So I think a similar question comes up, that is, how do you compare different effects to different levels of this creativity field when you have opposite impacts in these different levels? So I think that's one issue that is quite interesting to try to address. I'm not sure what tools we have, back to tools issue, to actually deal with that, because we already don't have many tools to address the trade-offs in the consumer welfare discussion, right? So let's see about the creativity. So that's one issue. A second issue that got me thinking is your comparison between cloud gaming and the Netflix right model, the streaming model. And really, I think the issue here is trying to understand what are the different patterns of competition within streaming models. Of course, there's a major change when you go to streaming in all these different industries and you compare music, video, and films, and gaming. But I think there are some fundamental differences in between these different streaming models, right? I think in the music industry, a large portion of the competition is about portfolios. You want to be in these different places or these different players where you have access to all music, in theory. And pretty much there is very little exclusivity there. So you do have access mostly in all these, if you go to Find Music or to Spotify or to Deezer, you're going to have pretty much access to all these broad portfolios, and they're going to compete in different levels there. Then if you move to Netflix and to films, I think there's a different pattern there. They started with big portfolios, but now they're moving to first runs. So they're producing content and they're differentiating themselves by content. That's why you have Netflix and you have Disney Plus and you're signing up to everything because you have exclusivity there and have a specific production going on, right? On gaming, there is a bit of that. And I think the biggest fear of the CMA, for instance, was really vertical integration and to a certain extent exclusivity on Call of Duty and all this. But I think there's another dimension to that. That is, the network effects there are bigger than in any other of the two, in the sense that if we're playing games with our friends and with large communities, you want to be where the large communities are. So streaming has a different level of competition, or at least a different framing of competition in gaming, I think, from the other ones. And then my question is, what's the impact of that when we go for competition law analysis? And one of the issues that I see a big impact is switching costs. I think there may be a much larger switching cost in the gaming industry because you're building roles or because you're building communities and you are in the middle of a game where you invested your energy and you have a sunk cost as a user of the game in that particular commitment that you made to that community that you don't have in music and that you don't have in films. You can just shift in between different platforms. So I wonder if understanding these different streaming models can lead us to very different perspectives on how competition law would apply. Even though they're similar, they do have different concerns that would apply here. So these are the comments I would have. Thank you very much.
They're very good comments, and I almost feel like I'm back in Create because we've done this, we're doing this, we're looking at different streaming models in different creative industries. And you're absolutely right. They are different. The games industry is a particularly interesting one because in theory, you're right that people will default to one place. But cloud gaming could, in theory, change that. Because cloud gaming is platform agnostic. If it works the way it's being promised, which it currently doesn't, but if it ends up working and fulfills its promise, you could be joining a game like World of Warcraft on the cloud, regardless of where you've purchased the game, which platform you're using. But this isn't currently the way it works. Currently, you focus on one game and you build your community there, which is why I have question marks about the subscription model. Because, I listen to I don't know how many songs on Amazon Music or Spotify or whatever. I only ever play one game at a time. So the idea that I would have a 500 game system in front of me, a database to choose from, makes me really question whether that's really how people play games. But there is a discussion about whether it's just opening up to a completely new customer audience, right? People that aren't hardcore gamers, but like to go into something for a little bit and jump out to the next one. So maybe it just opens a completely new consumer group that doesn't yet exist. So I find that really hard. I find it difficult to give any conclusive answers because we're really talking about a potential future that looks significantly different from how people play games now. But yes, that means you can't take anything we've learned about streaming in music and apply it to games in the same way, just like with films. I don't know if this is a thing in Brazil, but now Netflix offers games, which is insane. Has anyone tried to play them? It's just the worst. It's the worst. But it's interesting because you can see that they are going for a completely different customer group, right? They're going for the really, the same people who play those like Candy Crush games. Yes, on their television. Except in the UK, they brought in a game that is actually more complicated as a storytelling game. And they also did it on Netflix, and it was very good. And I was looking at it thinking, I really thought this was going to be bad. And it was for most of these games. But then they did it once with a big game. They've never done it again. So I'm assuming that not enough people played it. But there is now this merging of different cultural industries, which makes it far more complicated. But you know what the one thing is throughout that is consistent? It's the same companies. That is the one consistent thing we have, right? Netflix is going into games. Amazon has Luna, and it's not great, but Google tried to do its cloud gaming portfolio. So it's the same companies with the same resources venturing into those. So I think the competition implications on the market level are different, and we should look at them differently. But there is a larger question at the very first infrastructure and asset question. What it tells us that the same companies are entering all these markets. So I kind of sidestep the question about how you do it in competition policy, because I don't know. We have these reports on different industries. What we've not yet done is put them next to each other and see the differences, which I think actually I've written down would be a valuable exercise to do. Then tools for weighing the effects on different set of customers. It's the never-ending question, right? In competition policy, to some extent, it's not just a question in games. It's a question, for example, in sustainability. If you have a product that is more expensive for one set of customers, I don't know if you follow this, but in Europe we had a whole debate about if European customers pay more for a product, but it does less damage to the Amazonian. Should we offset that? And there was a discussion where they said, well, it doesn't really matter, because what do we care about is European consumers. And then people were saying, well, we should care about global consumers. It's a question that isn't resolved, but I think it's a fundamental one. And technically as it stands, in the US and the EU a little less, you can't really offset the negative effects on one consumer group against those of another consumer group. But I think it's a bit of a lie. And the reason I think it's a bit of a lie is because competition cases start with a choice. You choose which consumers to focus on. The idea that a competition authority objectively looks at all consumers in a market isn't true, right? They make a starting point about really which people they believe to be the most damaged. If we're a bit more explicit about that, we can say, well, our priority is this set of consumers for now, and we'll focus on the effect on them. But I think that's a policy statement that has to be explicit. And then you avoid the question of balancing effects across consumers. I do think there is a significant difference between your enjoyment of being interactive within a game and creating in the game because you do not own what you create there, versus changing a game and then selling on or not selling on, sharing with other people a new version of the game because you're creating a new product that competes. So I think that part fits more in our traditional competition framework. But there's no reason we couldn't look at the enjoyment of consumers within the game. So yeah, I think these are interesting questions.
Thank you very much. Great answers. And I think Dario is one. Oh,
sorry, I think I'm back now. So Dario, how are you? Welcome. And please join the conversation here. I know that you wanted to make a question. And with that, we're opening for anybody that wants to make questions also, both in presence and on video as well. And of course, Professor Juliana, please jump in anytime.
Hello, everyone. So first of all, thank you for having me here as well. Professor Magali, I'm deeply sorry that you are in Brazil while I'm not. I was one of Magali's students, I don't know how many years ago. Such a joy to be with you in this conversation now that you're in Brazil. I hope you have a really good time over there. regarding the discussion that we're having here now today, I haven't read your paper, but this one particularly. But I really like this kind of division. I have never thought about it between creativity and innovation. My first question would be in the sense of, I think, similar to the first question that Caio asked you before, but I don't know, in a common knowledge sense, I think when you're talking about creativity, we're thinking about someone that out of nowhere just had like a really good idea, and then he got in some way to develop a new product, a new service, etc. However, in the real world, and like in the world that we have IP rights and patents and copyrights, probably someone that even if he has like the best idea in the world nowadays, since he will not have access to the inputs necessary to like create a product, how can we kind of talk like about creativity? So my question would be, imagine like one scenario that in an upstream market, in an upstream input market, where someone has all the availabilities of the inputs, we can talk about, or like we will be talking about creativity in one sense. However, in a second scenario that the inputs are restricted to the companies that have the power and the rights to use it, how could like we define, and how could like this idea of creativity interacts with these two kind of words, one that we have a lot of restriction of inputs, and the other one that maybe the inputs for creativity are all available to everyone. So like this would be like my first question, about more like related to the definition of creativity. And the second question that unfortunately I'll have to ask, but like in economic terms, in a measurement way, normally when we talk about innovation and competition law and how can we measure innovation, normally we are talking about, I don't know, the number of patents, or like the money spent by a company in their R&D projects. If you're putting this creativity value, or this creativity goal into the equation, how can we measure, like how can we say that, or how could like also the creativity, or like more, as greater creativity we have, as a greater number of projects and innovation we have. So this kind of measurement that as an economist I need to ask because it struggles me. But thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
It's really nice to see you, even online. Yeah, it's not been that long, right? We're both very young, Daria. So on the measurement, right? This is always the main question, and well, there's a few things here. The first is that the study that I cite by Rietveld and Ishihara, I think, is a very good starting point, because what they do is they explicitly look at games, saying all those that are based on existing intellectual property. So basically what we're saying is existing patented or copyrighted storylines, game mechanisms, and so on, are not original. It's a big assumption, right? Because in a way you could take something that already exists and build on it. So it's a very rudimentary measure, I think. So I don't think it's perfect. I think we need to work on it, but there is something there where you say the existence of an established IP means it's not as creative as when a game comes up with something that isn't already subject to protection. It's a starting point. And I think we need to find other measures, because I have the same concern when we talk about the definition of innovation markets, which I think the measurements there aren't great either, because they are so much based on patterns. And now there are people who are trying very hard to come up with alternatives, taking strategic management literature and saying, what are the assets and resources and capabilities you need to innovate? And this is some extraordinary good work that is being done, but it all is based on existing or past historic ways of doing things. So all the models we have to measure, not just for creativity, but for innovation at large, are really rooted on markets like they used to exist, not markets that they can exist, which makes sense, right? Because we need to have something to start from. So in a way, I think we aren't there yet. The measurement isn't there yet, but just like I don't think the measurement is perfect yet for innovation markets. But for creativity, I think you can talk about measurement like the absence of IP, like Rietveld and Nishihara do, but you can also make a judgment call that when a big company that has been producing similar games for a long time buys up a small company that created something different, there is a red flag. That doesn't require a measurement, it requires a policy decision, right? It might be a bit controversial, but I don't think it's necessarily that controversial. And I don't think you need measurements, you just need a policy decision for that. But I think there's a fundamental question that I haven't solved, which is how you define creativity exactly, right? So how do you say that one game is more creative than another? I think for me, it's fairly evident where you have a similar game mechanism, which is vaguely subject to copyright protection. But if you have a similar game mechanism with a similar storyline, similar characters, and they're just dressed a little bit different, that is not as creative. But that is the obvious one. It becomes far more complicated when, as we said before, the Deadpool and Wolverine one, right? When there is a completely different dialogue, the storyline is different, it's just the same characters. So can we really say that's not creative? And I haven't figured out yet how you make the dividing line between what is sufficiently creative and what isn't. And I am not arrogant enough to say that I will solve this. I don't think I will, but I think I will pose the question about where you draw the line, but I'm not sure I'll give an answer that will satisfy lawyers, let alone economists. So that's the question. But I think there is a question about what is creative. Sometimes we don't need to measure things. And I'm sorry, right? But sometimes we don't need to measure things. Sometimes we need to sometimes measurement hides the fact that something was a policy decision. Sometimes we need just to be honest and say, we can't really measure this, but we have decided democratically or however it works, we have decided that this is something that we are going to look at. It's what we used to do in competition law. It's what we still do, but we pretend we don't, right? We have an answer that we want, and we just put the measurement in front of it and pretend that it was incredibly objective. That's not really how a lot of the practice works. So I will have to come up with measurement that will make me feel like I'm really cool and impressive. I doubt the competition authority will care very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank you, Professor Caio, and also FGV to host this meeting for us, not only for me, but I think for me and for Magali is a great opportunity to share, this commitment that we have to debate this kind of topic here in Brazil. I think it's not very common, Magali, to put, just like they said here, creativity in the middle of this discussion. Of course, we have several discussions related to intellectual property and competition, but your paper is really brilliant to, touching some points that for us, I think, opened for this huge discussion. So just thank you. I would like to thank you to come to Brazil. I think it was a very difficult and long journey for you. And of course, here we have some students that they are finishing their master course and PhD, and also professors. I'd like to share with you that on YouTube we have also professors, I think that you know, like Vinicius Klein saying hi to you, and Ricardo English Souza, that is professor from FAP, and he has a question for you. Right. So he asked it here, in digital platform markets, there is a trend of the winner takes it all. The competition to become the winner is interesting for innovation and efficiency. However, the result could be the creation of a monopolist that tends to inefficiently protect its position. How to deal with this?
How to deal with this? Right. Well, I don't know, because the European Union has been trying to deal with it for a few years. We came up with the Digital Markets Act. I have my question marks about it. Honestly, I think we are in a crisis. I genuinely think we are in a crisis. I think our tools and our ideas of efficiency just do not help us going forward in the particular context of digital markets. But that doesn't mean that it's competition law that's going to solve this. And I go back to the fact that I think really what we need is a regulation. That's what we've done before, where we have a natural monopoly, which we believe is the most efficient or is just the way the market works, then we accept it, but we impose sectoral regulation. That's what we've done before. I think that's what we're doing now. But the challenge, I think, is that these markets are winner take all also because of consumer behavior, right? And so it's very difficult to say that we're going to regulate it exactly like we do energy, because the structural features of an energy market are not the same as for a digital market, where we could, as consumers, very easily choose to do something different, but our behavioral biases mean that we do not. And so it becomes very paternalistic if you have sectoral regulation that intervenes where it's a consumer choice. Now, I am not necessarily opposed to paternalistic regulation, but I think it comes with a lot more complication, and there needs to be a lot more safeguards. I was at a conference recently where someone said very clearly the way that the European Union is now regulating digital markets has nothing to do anymore with economics or competition or efficiency. It's an industrial policy tool where we don't like the outcomes of these markets. We don't know how to structurally fix them. And so we're just going to intervene in the outcomes and impose obligations to do things differently. As someone who likes law, this makes me so uncomfortable. But as someone who doesn't think that we could do anything different, I think, yeah, sure. And I think that doesn't leave much room for competition law. I think competition law can then only come in on really specific behaviors that aren't covered, that are in the gray zone of regulation. But when it comes to regulation and what the right regulation is, I am not sure we've found it yet in the European Union. I mean, we had the same problem with the GDPR, right? I think we signaled to the world how data protection is important, but we didn't really find out the perfect way of doing it. The GDPR, in my opinion, was literally the DMA before the DMA. Basically, we were saying there are a few big companies that are collecting data in a way that makes us uncomfortable, but we're going to create a blanket rule that applies to everyone. Small companies suffer from the GDPR. I suffer from the GDPR because when I want to do something within the university, do you know how much time I take to look at it and go, do I need consent? Is this a legitimate interest? How do I get consent? What should I do about this? We didn't figure it out, but we gave a signal to the world that we were trying to figure it out. And I think that's the one advantage of the Digital Markets Act. It's not great. Really, I don't think it's great. But I'm hoping the rest of the world will take the parts that work, make something better. And then in 10 years, we can edit the DMA and pretend that, we knew that was what we were going to do all along. So I think these markets are winner take all. I do not think we can solve that with competition policy. So I think the only thing we can do is intervene on the outcomes that we want. But as I said, I find that so uncomfortable. but I don't know what else to do about it. And I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thank you, Professor Magali. I'm going to now pass to Kyle. Maybe there are some other questions from the audience.
Sure. I think the floor is open. If anyone from here or from Arthur.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely.
Better.
Okay, thank you, Magali. That was very interesting. But I'm not much more like a person from games, but more from cinema in general. And I'm studying that, and I'm questioning if I don't know if you agree with that, if whether or not dealing with creativity pushes more to a more, I'd say, protection of the competitive process, because you don't know, like Citizen Kane, it boomed in the box office. Fight Club also, and this war was creativity. You cannot measure creativity on the beginning. You measure it later. And that's the whole issue about creativity in the industry. You have to bet in something that is going to boom and something that is going to boost as innovation at all. So I believe that I personally, I believe that competition policy should be more focused on, I would say, creating the environment conducive to creativity. That could be in terms of ecosystems in streaming or anything like that. But that was also the paramount settlement in the back in the early 20th century. You should say, okay, the infrastructure here prohibits innovation in cinema industry and everything like that. So I don't know what your thoughts on that.
I wanna kind of challenge what you said, that you cannot measure creativity from the beginning. You only know when it booms at the box office. But booming at the box office means consumers like it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's creative. I am 100% sure I will like Deadpool and Wolverine. I have loved every Marvel movie that ever came out. I love live action Disney, but I am well aware that it's because it's nostalgia. It feeds into this thing that I've seen 1,000 times before. So the fact that consumers like it doesn't necessarily mean it's creative, but that leads us to a more fundamental question, whether it's something we should care about in competition law, right? Because if we care about consumer welfare, is this an aspect of consumer welfare or is it not? So I think it opens it up to a larger question. But I do agree with you about the competitive process part. And I think that the competitive process idea is one that in Europe we've had for centuries. Centuries is overstating it, but I'm thinking about before competition law as well. But anyway, let's say for decades. This process of the freedom to engage in economic activity. But this leads us to the question, which is something that I'm grappling with in my other research. What is the dividing line between something that is a competition issue, where you want to protect the involvement in economic activity because of competition, or let's say because of market power, versus you just want everybody to have a right to participate as a fundamental constitutional principle? They are not the same. And so I think we still need, when we're saying we're trying to protect the process, we're trying to protect the rights of people to be involved, because we believe that leads to more competition, which leads to a benefit to society. And to me, one of the benefits to society is this creativity, but I'm well aware that it kind of might not work with the box office booming idea. But I agree, like, I think this has happened more implicitly before, including in Paramount. We also had a discussion about book publishing and journalism, and similar questions there where you had big authors being in favor of mergers or not, whereas the small authors weren't. They have different interests. There is a massive interest when you are established and well off to keep the status quo, and you might be producing things that consumers like, right? This is why I'm asking the question whether, if consumers like watching a live action Disney, should we take the risk that maybe there will be fewer live action Disneys because that budget will be spread over more smaller, more independent movies. That's a risk of what I am saying. I fundamentally believe we should care, but I am very open to people saying no, this is not something we should be doing.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? People online, here. Yes, sure.
It's just a curiosity related to your research. I think that you all cover here several aspects from the paper and from the presentation. So thank you, Analisia. Thank you, Rodrigo, and Dario, and everyone here. But I'm just curious about if you feel, as you know a lot about the UK system and the European system, is there any difference between the views they have about this topic?
Oh, yeah. So the UK, I don't think this is controversial to say, the UK has always been the more rational, traditional force in Europe. They are less likely to let go of rigor and economic analysis. This is why people were surprised that they took a more forceful stand with Microsoft, Activision, Blizzard, but also with other mergers, including Meta, Giphy, because people were surprised, because usually the UK is the one that takes the rationalizing stance. And it's also why, on a side note, the UK is no longer a member of the European Union. That to me was I was afraid of that, because I thought it would allow the European Union to have one less objective voice in the debate. And I think that's true, but we've also come to a point where that raises a question about the extent to which the UK framework of more robust economic analysis works. So they're now coming up with they've now come up with a new version of digital regulation that is different from the Digital Markets Act. And we don't, we talk about that for a long time, but we don't really know what it's going to be like. But there is a question there about whether they'll make a difference when you have a tool that is less at the European Union level, less focused on this kind of evidence-based effect analysis. And so this is, I think, now an interesting moment to be in. So effects analysis is, in Europe in general, changing, becoming less prominent for good and bad reasons. I don't know what the UK is going to do. Not to forget that a lot of Europeans are part of the UK Competition Authority, because despite Brexit, we are there to stay. We are not budging. You cannot get us out. And so in the competition system, we are there. So I don't know what that means, whether we will push it towards more of a European style. But for the moment, we have not. So I know for a fact that the Competition Authority was less open to this kind of argument of creativity, because for the music streaming exercise that they did, we did submit some reflections, and they just said, well, you know what, we'll wait to figure this. We think consumers are benefiting, but also we'll figure this out later when we have a kind of new digital regulation. We don't have to deal with it now as the Competition Authority. Maybe we can deal with it later as the regulator. So let's see whether they deal with it or not.
So any other questions, comments? We're coming close to 11 a.m. That's when we said that we would wrap up, but let me check if there is any other questions, comments.
You too.
No? Any final remarks then? Professor Magali Eben, if you'd like to wrap up and close the final remarks. But before that, I'd like to thank you again for coming. It's a great pleasure to host the event here, and it's really within the realm of our nucleus, which is Competition, Public Policy, Innovation, and Technology. So it couldn't be more fit to our discussion. And thank Professor Juliana Domingues, who actually really made it viable and possible for us to be here, sharing Professor Magali Eben with us, which is really fantastic. So thank you so much for that. But please, we have the floor. We have the floor to wrap up.
I mean, I'm very happy to be here in Brazil. I'm so glad to be doing the tour and for Juliana to be helping me doing the tour. So no, this is great. I have always been fascinated, by what goes on here. Even though I tried very hard to follow the decisions that are made here by the competition authority and just trying to wrap my head around it. Also, the comparisons between the US and the EU sometimes. It's really difficult. And that's why I found it really fascinating, because I want to come here and I want to see whether things that I say make no sense to you at all. So as a final remark, if none of it made sense, you can let me know and send me a message. But yes, I'm very excited to be here and to see what else.
Thank you so much, Magali. And Juliana, would you like to comment on the other events that are going to happen this week? Because it's just like you're just kicking off a week that's very intense. So I think it would be good for the people that are watching.
Yeah. So on Wednesday, we're going to have this meeting inside Mackenzie. We have different topics, so I can only share with you the topics, but we were trying our best, just to share all the agenda and the schedule for Magali. And as you know, Magali is doing a great job, and maybe she can share for everyone that is following this opening session about the Escola, right? I think it's a great opportunity. The last time we were together was there, and the last meeting was recently happened in Germany. And I am still feeling that we can involve much more the academics here from Brazil. We know the difficulties related to the prices, the flight prices for everyone going outside Brazil. But I think it's also an opportunity to listen a little bit the changes. You are able to share much more related to the board now that we have a new. Now we have the decision made from the next year, and then everybody can prepare themselves. So I think it's an opportunity to share it. And during Wednesday, we're going to have this meeting inside Mackenzie with Vicente Bagnoli, that he's also from Escola. Professor Caio is also a member. And on Wednesday, and then we have Thursday, another conference with FGV Rio, with Nicolas Ingales, that is also a member from Escola. And the next week, on Monday, we're going to share some ideas with Commissioner Vitor Fernandes, IDP, that is also professor from IDP. And finally, she's just going to spend several days with me at the University of São Paulo, the unit that we have in Ribeirão Preto. So I think Magali will cover different regions, accents, and also climate change, right? So it'll be fun. I think it's much better, than the tour that we had recently from Taylor Swift here.
Think I make far less money than Taylor Swift. Yeah, so Escola, the Academic Society for Competition Law. This is my end of my first year being on the executive, which is fun. It's a great group of academics. So please come. And I think there are some Brazilian members, but I would like more Brazilians to be at the conferences. I am well aware that it's a costly endeavor. The next one is in Chicago, so it's going to be costly for me as well. So no, definitely come. And yeah, I'm talking about loads of different things whilst here. So I'm going to be talking about the data protection competition law case. I think that's on Wednesday. I'll be talking about UK versus EU digital regulation. Perfect. Yeah, so Wednesday is the meta data protection competition law. Then we do digital regulation. And then I have a paper that I have written that I would like everybody to tell me everything how wrong it is, which is going to be about the value of market definition and why we can absolutely not get rid of market definition ever, which is obviously not what the majority of people think. So I'll be talking about that as well. And yeah, I think you have the whole flyer there, right?
And Thursday, the UK regulation, digital market.
Yeah, digital markets. Yeah, so market definition. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the
Challenges in the EU.
yeah, very
Very broad. So yeah, please come to whichever you can come to, and you'll get a overview of the research that I am doing. And thank you very much, everybody, for paying attention, and particularly for bringing me to Brazil.
okay.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was a pleasure to have you here again at FGV, and I wish you a great week. I mean, it's an intense week of discussions, and of course, in the course and the discussions in USP Ribeirão as well. I think this is going to be fantastic. So welcome to Brazil, and it's great that we're kicking off at FGV. So thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you for the ones that are watching both in Zoom and YouTube. So it's been a pleasure to host this. As I mentioned to Professor Magali, this is the last week of vacations here in Brazil. So we wish to have more people in presence, but it's an issue that we can't solve as our calendar is still like missing the students at the school at this point. But thank you very much again. Thank you, Professor Rodrigo, Professor Analisia. It was a great pleasure to have you here again with us. And of course, Professor Juliana, I mean, again, thank you very much for coming here. Thank you. Bye-bye. Now we close.